New York State generally, New York City particularly, to bring broadband technology to all of its citizens and what we can do to empower Silicon Valley. Harlem, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. And thank you, Silicon Harlem, for inviting me to participate in this conversation. It's a very exciting day to be part of this inaugural conversation. Just to give you a little background of my organization and where we've come from, I work for a national nonprofit called Connected Nation. And Connected Nation exists for one very clear reason, and that's to help improve lives through access, adoption, and use of technology. We essentially subscribe to the idea that in order for communities to strive in this global economy, they need to organize, they need to create plans around the idea of technology, and then lastly, but most importantly, they need to act in order to empower the individuals that live in that community, in order to bring jobs in order to basically improve the quality of lives for the residents that live in that community. So as part of our, and just to talk a little bit more about where Connected Nation started, we started off in Kentucky as a state-based initiative that was developed to address the challenges of access that Kentucky was experiencing. Only 60% of Kentucky had access to broadband infrastructure a little over 10 years ago. In addition to that, people were not adopting broadband. So we quickly realized that there were three critical areas that we needed to address. First of all, before you even begin to create solutions or propose solutions, you need to have a clear understanding of what the problem is. And then that's data. I think one of the speakers earlier talked about the importance of data. So the very basic data was to look at where broadband was available, and that entailed working with broadband providers to create a statewide map of broadband infrastructure. And once you had that map, you were able to see where broadband was, but more importantly, where broadband was. The second part of the activities was to work with all 120 counties in Kentucky to create strategic technology plans. And so it entailed us having staff members go to every single one of those communities over a two-year period, sit down with them, create a technology team, and that technology team consisted of members of every sector represented in that community. And that was very essential to bring together people that traditionally did not talk to each other. We're talking nonprofits, we're talking tourism, agriculture, economic development, business, just across the spectrum, bring them into the room and have a conversation about where technology was in that community, and then to essentially do an assessment, a technology assessment, and then talk about the vision. What was the vision for the different sectors? And then once that was documented, what needed to be done in order to achieve the vision of that community. And the third thing was to consistently conduct research on broadband availability, use, and adoption at a statewide level and at a local community level. And essentially, some of those communities did their own local surveys. And it's pretty amazing how a localized survey can look very different from a county-wide or a statewide. So we did that with all 120 communities. And as a result of that work, we started to see significant increases in access, because once those gaps were identified, and believe me, it wasn't an easy process, because sometimes when you had the map, you went into the community, essentially showed them the map and said, this is what the coverage you have. Well, about 60–80% of those meetings ended up with angry team members saying, I live there, I don't have coverage. So we had to reconfigure those maps based on feedback. And sometimes people just didn't know what services were available to them. They may have known about the bigger providers, but did not know some of those local, smaller providers. So due to the success of that project, we started to kind of get calls from other states asking for the same kind of assistance. And thus, Connected Nation was born as a way for us to not only address challenges in Kentucky, but to address challenges across the country. So in 2008, the Broadband Data Improvement Act was passed in Congress with bipartisan support. That act was really based on our Kentucky model of gathering data. The act called for the improvement of the quality of broadband data at a local and state level, and it also called for the promotion of affordable broadband for everyone across the nation. And once that act was funded, we were able to, and are still right now, working in about 10 states, doing community level work and also mapping, along with other entities that are doing it across the country, including here in New York. So I guess one of the things that we did in 2011, because we expanded outside of Kentucky, was to find ways to make our process more effective and more efficient, because driving to 120 counties across a state was not efficient, and it was very difficult. So we had to take advantage of what? Technology. And automate. We developed a framework of a framework to assist these communities, which was scalable and measurable, that they could take advantage of to be able to access their own technology, access, adoption, and use. Under access, it was getting a deeper understanding of, do they actually have service? Who are the providers available? What is the highest speed that most of that community can access? And so there were a range of questions under access. Under adoption, what is that community doing to overcome barriers to adoption? What programs exist to help vulnerable populations work with broadband? What digital learning initiatives are available? And then use is how we were talking about meaningful use, because adoption really is getting people online. Use is using applications for jobs, entrepreneurship and incubation and everything that we do. So use becomes a very, very critical part of what a community needs to be aware of. So as of today, we have 131 communities that are actively participating in the community engagement process. And so, which remains very, very exciting for us. As far as today, we have 3 very important verticals that have pretty much remained consistent across since we started. However, we have had to evolve with how technology changes. The challenges of when we started are very different from the challenges of today. When we first started, the conversation started with, what is broadband? And you had to essentially describe what broadband was. And now the discussion today is not really about what broadband is. It's, do I have sufficient broadband in my community? How can I get better? So people know what broadband is. Adoption is also pretty different across the demographics, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So as far as our verticals are concerned, we have connected insights. We continue to do research on broadband adoption and use. We continue to work with providers to show where broadband is available and not. And we continue to be involved in the policy discussions. As far as community engagement, I said we continue to work with communities. And then one of our big and emanating projects is around digital learning, and it's job skills, training people and preparing them for jobs and placing them in jobs. And it's also working with schools that are transitioning to one-to-one device initiatives, which are very huge, because transitioning to one-to-one initiatives, so much discussion is around the infrastructure, but the bigger discussion is really about curriculum and the people, the teachers, preparing them for that, for changing the way they teach. And then we also provide, we have a Drive learning hub. That's a hub where people can go and learn how to use different kinds of applications that's widely available. So that's a little bit of background on what we use. And just to answer your question on adoption, our model is built around the idea of adoption, access, adoption, and use. And our mantra is that the most effective planning starts at a grassroots level. So the work that Silicon Harlem is doing is very consistent with what we do, and it's very consistent with our model, and it's the model that we've seen be successful in communities across the country. So I'm extremely pleased to be part of this discussion because I think that the discussion is on the right track.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you. We'll get a chance to take questions and hear from the rest of our panelists in a bit. I think that was very important to set the stage for, it starts at a community level. Here we are at the grassroots. Mm-hmm. But you raised important questions about the multi-stakeholder reality. Any common public good like broadband has to bring in everybody to make it work. The need for strategic plans, and we'll hear about some more ideas on that. Scalability and affordability and capacity building, getting people involved, training them, getting women involved. So I'll leave it at that for now. We'll come back to our panel. I believe we have a very special guest who we'd like to hear from now before we continue.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, as promised, one of our great partners here at Silicon Harlem and great leaders of Harlem and great influencer of New York City and great servant to the country. We are quite honored always when she's in our presence. And she's here to bring some remarks. Bruce?
So once again, without further ado, allow me to introduce Councilmember Inez Dickens, our council person who has been a supporter of Silicon Harlem from our inception.
Good morning, techies. It's a pleasure. And Gary, thank you so much for leading this. Thank you so much, because I'm short. And I have on heels. It's a pleasure to be a part of Silicon Harlem's tech conference this morning. And I want to particularly thank the co-founders, Clayton and Bruce, because they took the leadership to bring this community into the 22nd century. I want to thank Congressman Rangel, who has been a partner in this and who I think you've heard from this morning. Of course, Christopher and Felicia for hosting this talk that will bring innovative ideas that will indeed improve our tech hub. But as fast as the newest internet sensation fades, it's important that our technology hubs remain up to speed. It is imperative that our tech hubs are incubated and resources are spent to develop them and to attract our future leaders. And by the way, that's exactly what Dr. Marta Vega does every day. So I want to acknowledge you. Stand up, Marta, please. Harlem holds and is a special place for most everyone in the world. It embodies the vibrant culture of history and is the center of the African American cultural revival and diaspora. It is the home away from home for many people and is considered the center of creativity, intellectualism, artistry, and musical inspiration in the Black culture. And by the way, did you see some of that artwork outside? Fabulous. I'm scared to death of my pockets. Because of its history, location, and accessibility to public transportation, it's important that Harlem be transformed into the technological, innovative hub that it must become. And it's because of the accessibility. You come through Harlem to go to the New England states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, to go to Connecticut, to go to Rhode Island, to go to Westchester County. And what better place to be able to get to the airports, whether we're talking about, hi John, whether we're talking about Kennedy or whether we're talking about at LaGuardia. It is all of us. We must embrace this tech boom and not fear it. We must invest in it and secure it. And it will make Upper Manhattan, Northern Manhattan, a strong incubator for talent and technology. This will not only boom our marketability, but it's going to attract companies into our revolutionized background. And in case you haven't heard, Harlem is on the upswing. It has always been welcoming and accepting. The addition of tech scene will be a bonus. It will create employment opportunities. It will create and enhance our businesses of all sizes. And it's going to give Harlem a true renaissance of today's time. And because of organizations like Silicon Harlem, the village of Harlem is attracting startups in this area. They are defining these tech spaces and becoming the innovators of the brand. These tech hubs support education initiatives such as STEM, STEAMs, APPS Youth Leadership Academy, builds the neighborhood's broadband infrastructure, and creates a partnership between the local universities, the DOE schools, and our businesses. Harlem is leading the way, and with all of you, and with the 3 levels of government, we will dominate New York's technology resurgence. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Let's have another round of applause for...
Yes. That was actually a very good, I think, addition to our discussion, because Madame Councillor provided some very good concrete examples of what is happening here in Harlem, which Heather, I think, pointed us toward the need for grassroots movements, starting at the grassroots. You're going to connect your nation. Well, your nation begins out your front door. So here we are in Harlem, our front door. How are we going to get it connected? We heard from Heather some of the basic ingredients that are needed at the start. I'd now like to turn to Joshua Breitbart, who's the Senior Research Fellow with New America's Open Technology Institute, because I think we need some more ideas on innovative policies that might help us get Silicon Harlem off the ground. And Joshua, I understand that you actually think we might learn something from the interstate highway system. So I want to hear about that, or maybe the analogy there. So can you share some of those lessons with us and from work you've done in other parts of the country?
Yes, thank you, Gary, and thank you, all of you. As a kid from Brooklyn, it's a great honor to be welcomed to Harlem, to join these panelists, and thank you to Clayton and Bruce and all the people who have organized this event. This question of how broadband impacts community, I think, is a funny one, because often when we're asking it, it's not today, but oftentimes it's a rhetorical question. It's part of a sales pitch to communities that have for whom broadband has yet to deliver. And I have a hard time in that situation sometimes, because I have a love-hate relationship with the internet. I don't know, does anybody else have a love-hate relationship with it? Yeah, and so if you have to talk about broadband as something that people should use, that becomes a challenge. I have no doubt that it contributes to a rise in GDP. We were discussing that on a prep call, but that's not evenly distributed. It creates jobs, but it also destroys jobs. We talked about disruption in various industries before. And I think that, we have to think about what community means when we're talking about the impact on community and how we make sure that it's a benefit for Harlem and for the people of Harlem. One of the experiences I have where, this idea of the interstate was really instructive was in Detroit. We were forming something called the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, and it was a range of community organizations, environmental justice organizations, housing, anti-poverty, as well as media and tech groups that were talking about how to bring funding from the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, which was in the stimulus package, to Detroit. We started talking to people about this idea of the information superhighway, and those words trigger a certain experience for people who live through the construction of the highway system. And it was, that network was sold with some of the same rhetoric around speed, mobility, freedom, jobs. And so we really said, how can we make sure that we, we do this a different way? In that experience, again, if Detroit was to the interstate highway system, or you would have thought, as Silicon Valley is to broadband. But in fact, what happened when the highways were built was, a white flight to the suburbs, the decentralization of the auto industry, union jobs moved to non-union states, moved to Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. And Detroit was left with these huge chasms in the city, really as much as any urban area, but it touched every urban center that really divided neighborhoods. So, today we're really working to heal cities from that experience and to create more walkable neighborhoods, build more community relationships. And I think that if we look at what, broadband certainly doesn't create the same physical impact in a community the way that a 8 or 10 lane highway might. But if you look at the shrinking of local newsrooms, the Detroit Free Press is no longer a daily newspaper. You really do see an impact on the information landscape, which is, I think, analogous. And you do wind up with some people in a community, in a city, who have broadband and some who don't. And it really is a kind of chasm that is like the highways that have divided or, in the case of many neighborhoods, demolished neighborhoods, certainly some of the vibrant African-American communities in places like Detroit. So I think that there's a real opportunity to do it differently, and I think actually communities that for whom broadband hasn't delivered really have an opportunity to put some thought into how to do it differently, and I think that there's an urgent need to do that, to create a more walkable internet. And I think that one that really builds local relationships, make sure that jobs come to the community, that we don't have the kind of displacement that we've seen from the tech industry in a place like San Francisco, and that we think about it in the context of communities, neighborhoods like Harlem, not just in the context of a city like New York or a region or the country. In Detroit, what we did as the Digital Justice Coalition is we developed a set of principles, the digital justice principles, that the 4 essential tenets were access, participation, common ownership, and healthy communities. And those grounded us as we formed and formulated and developed the programs using some of that stimulus funding. One of the things that came out of it also was an idea of digital stewardship and a program of digital stewards. And the key elements of digital stewardship is neighbors teaching neighbors and connecting with neighbors. The idea of focusing technology on the transformation of community, not as an escape. And a lot of people in low-income communities need to relocate to pursue economic opportunity, and that that keeps the economic benefit from staying local. So make sure people are very rooted locally, and that the focus is on the community. Key also is participation in the design and construction of our networks, and making sure that those networks match to the relationships that we've built over decades, really, in communities, and not a sense that there's a new digital network that we need to start to conform our relationships to. And so the programs that we developed in Detroit and in places like Red Hook and Brooklyn and Philadelphia emphasized people building relationships within the classroom and a lot of peer learning, focusing their skills on urgent community challenges, strengthening relationships to community anchor institutions, churches, media centers, small businesses. And I think that those guiding principles in implementing programs of that nature are really how we make sure that communities get the best of broadband and minimize the negative disruptive impacts. And so I think that the idea of Silicon Harlem and making sure that there's a focus at the community scale is a great opportunity, and it's really great to be here to be part of this discussion and learn from everybody who's contributing.
Thank you, Joshua. That's great. We're going to have chance for some questions and interactive discussion. But now we've heard how, it should start at the grassroots. Connected nation, connected Harlem. We've seen that yes, there are some disruptive patterns that can unfold. Later this afternoon at 1:15, I have to be at the UN to participate on a panel on child online protection. So security and privacy are a big issue when you have ubiquitous access to broadband. But now I want, before we get our questions and we go to our next panelists, I want to see the hands again from the students up there. Who are the students that were here? Okay, now, before today's over, I think between these two speakers, you've heard enough to probably get us started on the path to connecting Harlem and connecting us to the global information society. But I'm sure you're all thinking, oh, how can I compete with Verizon? Or how can I compete with, AT&T? Well, we have a panelist who was going to help show us that you don't have to be the biggest person on the block to compete. Shrihari Pandit is the president and CEO of Stealth Communications. And when we think of gaining access to broadband, most of us would think of those big providers. But that's not the case. Shrihari, can you provide us with some insight into how smaller players can be just as effective or even more so in bringing broadband connectivity? And I'm personally happy to support this because I live at 128th Street, and I can't send a text from my bedroom. I can do it from my bathroom, but not from my bedroom. I should know how this works. Anyway, I'd like to turn it over to Shrihari to hear some of your experiences.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Just want to make sure this is working. Okay, great. So my wife and I started this business back in 1995. We're a small business. We're a certified MWE with the City of New York. And we provide dedicated internet access to businesses, primarily in New York City. So over the course of the 18, 19 years we've been running the business, it's been very difficult for us to get these dedicated fiber optic lines that go from our hubs, down in Lower Manhattan, to different businesses throughout the city. So a couple of years ago, we started working on the process of negotiating with the City of New York about the possibility of laying our own fiber optic lines underneath the streets of Manhattan and the other boroughs, just like what Verizon and Time Warner does. So last year in February of 2013, we were granted one of the first information franchises with the City of New York. And an information franchise is basically a public right-of-way agreement that allows us to have authorization to the city's land above ground and below ground to be able to install our cabling. And so once we were granted the franchise last year, we decided to hire our own construction crew, which is actually pretty cool. I think we're one of the very few companies in New York City that do this. Typically everyone contracts it out, but we decided we wanted to hire folks. So we have a small crew that actually is responsible for laying all our fiber optic cables. So we started construction in June of last year. We currently have cable now from around 68th Street on the west side of Manhattan all the way down to the tip of Lower Manhattan. We have a little over 80 buildings penetrated with fiber optic connections. Just in under about a year, which is pretty cool. And what we wanted to do was be able to deliver gigabit access speeds that typically under 1/3 the cost of what businesses typically pay. And we're able to accomplish it in a couple of ways, not only by using our own fiber optic lines and using our in-house construction crews, but we've actually modified the fiber optic transceivers, the lasers, if you will, with a unique encoding scheme that helps us, use an alternative technology for providing that service. I'm trying to think what else, but I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of what we've done. We have ambitions to try to grow this network as fast as we can, all the way up to the Harlem area. And so for us, because we're a self-financed business, it's just my wife and I actually funding the entire operation. So we're driven by customers. So for all the steps that we've grown all the way up to 68 Street was all done by incremental customers. And so as we get customers in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, we will be expanding the network out there. We're also now looking into going into Brooklyn, for early next year. So that's also really exciting for us. The challenges in our business is the right-of-way, which, obviously we have with the city. But when you go out into the outer boroughs, you don't have this common underground conduit system like what we have here in Manhattan and the Bronx. So, those are private conduit systems. So you have to negotiate with them. Also, labor, because this field is very unusual. You don't really have students or college graduates that have adequate training of working underground. So it's something that you have to learn from being within the trade. So, that we kind of find fascinating. Another interesting insight is you would think Manhattan's full of fiber. I mean, there is a lot of fiber underground. Unfortunately, a lot of the fiber cables don't really reach a lot of the major buildings, office buildings here, even in Midtown Manhattan, as you can imagine, which is crazy. So just imagine what you have up here in Harlem, just limited to copper and maybe coax. Believe it or not, in Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan, meaning obviously south of 125th Street, the same problems exist, actually. It's really funny. We couldn't believe this. When we first started construction, we were wondering, my wife and I, would there be sufficient amount of businesses? And before we, as we started construction, we found out quickly that there's significant amount of demand, even in Class A buildings. So anyway, just astonishing.
Great. Thank you very much. There is no doubt demand. I think what you've raised is you've shown us the spectrum. Capacity building, we need trained people. We need the people to do this right down to the ground and the infrastructure, the wires and pipes that make this work. But you can make it happen at a community level. I want to go back to something that Joshua said, technology is a wonderful thing when it works. And for most of us, we just take it for granted. It's like breathing. You don't think about it until you can't, until you don't have connectivity. But in the developing world, which was at the forefront of the fight for equitable access, and it was women, what we used to call the telephone ladies, who saw that this wasn't fair. They should have access because it was a tool of empowerment. They were schlepping the same load of soybeans to the same market for the last millennium. They wanted to be able to know that there was more information to do a better trade, and they've been on the forefront. And women in the developing world, the least developed world, where people are living on $1.25 a day, did a study. Women are prepared to spend up to 10% of their disposable income to have access to communications, because that's how important it is for empowerment. I've heard people say to me, it's just sisters want to talk. Well, yeah, of course sisters do want to talk, but they want to talk about business and they want to talk about empowering themselves and their family. So I think we've seen a really good, how that can start at the grassroots level, how it needs people to push from the grassroots level, but you have to have the capacity and you have to have the infrastructure. And of course, you always have to have a lawyer to pour some cold water and reality on things. So, which isn't fair. Sorry, Olivier, but Olivier Sylvain is a law professor at Fordham, and he's focused a great deal on policy issues like internet governance, which is a big policy issue, I can tell you. But recently, you outlined, Olivier, in your Wall Street Journal article, how states, let's blame it on the states here, are restricting efforts by local governments to make the internet more available to its residents. So what lessons do you think this provides for Harlem? And given what you've heard from your other panelists, maybe you could address some of the challenges that we might have from a political policy level to make this happen.
Thanks, Gary. I think for that introduction. And I'm very happy to be playing a part in this conversation. I do think it's important to hear from people who are on the ground trying to make things work. I often ask myself before this event what I would contribute to conversation on this. And I think the Wall Street Journal piece does touch on it. And I think, a couple of things on this point. And I'll turn to my prepared remarks. Is that there are moments when you recognize that broadband is, on the one hand, an information tool, but it's just one of the many resources that are available to us that are contested, right? And so for me, this is not putting cold water on the story. This is making clear to everyone that this is something that we all have a stake in the same way that we have to fight over electricity, the same way we have to fight over basic services. This is a policy problem that everybody has to have some role in engagement with. And I think you've heard from everyone on the panel thus far about the different ways in which this matters. And the way I think about it, and the way the journal piece talks about it, and others have written about this, talk about internet governance and the role that local communities might have, is a notion of competition. This is just one of the ways we might think of this, right? So I think it's great that Verizon, a sponsor of the event, is invested as much money as it has in the infrastructure, in fiber infrastructure in the country, in New York City. I think it's quite an achievement. It's obviously a very expensive achievement. I think other emergent companies are going to realize how expensive an endeavor it really is. But there are all these levers at the policy level that would enable further competition. And that's why I think there is a role for local communities to play in this conversation. Some of you may have heard a little bit about the debate regarding about network neutrality. What it is, it's now generically called in policy circles the open internet debate. Question right now before the FCC, before policymakers, is to what extent do we think of the internet or broadband as a utility? To what extent is it something that should be a function of the market? This is a question that, on the one hand, you can resolve easily and just assume, as it has for the past decade and a half, be regulated as a market-based service. But in truth, everything that you've heard from the panelists is that it comes closer to being what the FCC has called a general use technology. Right? It comes close to sounding like the sort of thing you need access to in order to get jobs, in order to make a living. So I'm not going to make a political speech about this, but it is worth thinking about that intervention at the FCC level. Now, states, too, have an important role to play. Fortunately, in New York State does not restrict municipal cities and local communities from building out their own networks and to compete with the Verizons and Time Warners of the world. But there are states that do, and the FCC is now looking at ways in which are preempting state restrictions of municipal build-out. That's part of the story, though, about ways in which the city can be supported by the state in other ways, right? And I think it's great to have had city officials involved in making decisions about fiscal policy, to support local efforts to build out broadband. I guess the last point I'd want to make, and I guess I'd want to tie this to points I think Heather started with, and it's a dichotomy that, taxonomy, forgive me for the legal phrasing and academic phrasing, access, adoption, and use. These are terms of art that the FCC is thinking about, and I think it's helpful to start thinking about ways that you want to deploy your attention and direct them to those three concerns. First is the question of access. Is there actually, can you text from your living room? Is there that basic infrastructure available? Second, are people actually taking up that service when it's available? But I do think one of the most interesting is this third, and this impacts communities of color in particular. There are different patterns of use. For whatever reason, there's research that suggests that people of color, African Americans, Latinos in particular, tend to access the internet mostly through mobile technologies. We don't have yet these sorts of, the technology is not yet there to deliver the kind of speed and capacity that wireline service provides. That's an interesting sort of question, especially if it affects the way you think about the way the open internet ought to be governed. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk about some other stuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just before we turn it over for questions, just to pick out, it's interesting the access is, mobile technology people of color, because that's where the growth is. That's where the growth is in the developing world. That's where people are going online, it's mobile technology that's getting them there, and I think that's actually that percentage, that segment of the population is leading the way. I don't think it's following in that sense. That's where we're all going to go. But to get there, we have to have access. You won't have adoption unless you have access, and you won't have action unless you have access and adoption. So we'd like to hear now from you any questions that you might have for our panel or comments you might want to make. We'd like to start with questions. Richard, you go ahead.
Yeah, a two-part question. First for Heather, do data exist, talking about the access and adoption, do data exist about different communities in New York City and what access there is to the internet and broadband and what the household adoption is? And then for Shihara, this morning we heard about a $3.5 billion investment in fiber in New York, but we're hearing from you that a lot of neighborhoods don't have access and still rely on copper. What is the disconnect?
Sure.
We have not primarily conducted specific research in New York. However, over the last 10 years, we've seen leaps and tremendous increases in broadband access across the country. Of course, in rural areas continue to face some very specific challenges. As far as adoption and use, we've conducted some national research on that. And right now, our research results have been pretty consistent with research from universities and Pew Foundation, which has found that 70% of people in the United States are adopting broadband. But when you start to cut that across income levels, race, the numbers look tremendously different. When you cut it across race, we have Hispanic and Blacks adopting at 59%, which is tremendous. And then when you cut it on income level, households earning less than $25,000 a year, they're adopting at less than 50% rate across the country. Then highest education as well. There's a wide difference. And then, of course, rural, urban as well. Urban people tend to adopt more. And when we've done research at a more localized level, the data is pretty consistent as well in different communities. And then when we also further analyze data that we got from non-adopters to understand why they were not adopting, typically we think about cost as the lead barrier to adoption, but actually relevance in the United States is a bigger issue. And when asked, why are you not using the internet, they talk about, I don't need it. So, and that is a major issue in communities. And with the evolution of mobile technology, you have minority groups being the fastest adopters and seniors of mobile technology, and yet that's not really translating to use. And by use, we're talking about engaging for education, for jobs, as opposed to engaging for social media and that kind of thing. So, and that's very important for the type of programming that we need in minority communities, is programming that's specifically targeted to helping people understand the relevance of technology in their lives. Essentially, you have services that are not available anymore in person. You can only access them online. You have opportunities that people are not taking advantage of, although they know what broadband is, and they do have a smartphone.
Just to add, answering your first part of the question, New York City has a broadband map. It's ran by NYC EDC, and New York State also has a broadband map on the state level. So I forget who operates that, but it's the New York State Broadband Office, I think. If you just do a Google search, and you'll be able to get the data that you're requesting, from the city and state. What was your second question? I forgot.
This morning we heard about a $3.5 billion investment in New York City fiber, but you talked about how a lot of buildings are still reliant on copper.
Correct.
What is the disconnect between the huge investment?
Well, right now Verizon's laying the groundwork to make files available throughout the city. So they are running fiber up and down the avenues and streets. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that cable's penetrated into the buildings yet. So I think you would have to read their franchise and their commitment to the city. I think it's about getting the cable in the ground first. Basically they have to have a commitment of passing every home or business. I think that's what the first obligation is, and then they may have further obligations at some point, which is related to the penetration to get off the street and into a building or a house.
Right. So one of the things that we advocate for, because tremendous amount of money is put into infrastructure, is really finding projects that partner with it or money that's allocated to making sure that once you have this technology, we've seen examples of cities that have tremendous speeds, but you have communities that are just not interested because no money was put into the people part of it. Because at the end of the day, technology really, for me, is the foundation. It's really about the people that are using it and the work that's happening on it. And that's a disconnect sometimes with a lot of projects. It's they miss the people part, and you find that in education programs where school systems invest in 1,000 iPads, and then a month later they say, oh my gosh, all the kids lost the iPads and they're using Facebook. But the failure there was on the human part of it. Did you prepare the parents? Did you prepare the teachers? Because you're taking a teacher that for 30 years has been teaching them one way, and now you're saying you can't use your paper lesson plans anymore. You're using these apps to teach a math class. And so it's the people part of technology that often is the disconnect, where we're so focused on the fastest and the best.
And a wonderful thank you to the panel too. This is a class worth taking. Gary, you spoke about the international telecommunication, the impact you did for the African countries. You announced, you said Kenya, I'm from Tanzania, and we acknowledge the efforts that you're making through that. We thank you so much. But I would like to thank the gentleman who asked the question, what is broadband? My fellow students and I could agree that we didn't understand about what is broadband. We are now into technology of wireless headphones, wireless, each and everything is wireless. We didn't know the impact of the word broadband. Thank you, panel, for explaining that to us. Now, a challenge to you, or a question to you is, what are the challenges that you face in performing or in making sure that the society has this broadband approach? And second of all, we as students, the generation that we are being upbringed by our professional mentors, by our professional institution from our colleges, both private and public, we are not engaged to broadband. We are not engaged, or we are not informed on how broadband operates. The panel have been speaking about the outreach to the society, but what do you do? What approach do you have? How do you reach the students? We are being upbringed in this technological era. How to facilitate ourselves through broadband? How we can reach the community through broadband? And you are talking about adding this to the utility, that it will be water, transportation, and broadband will be a part of it. So, what challenges you face and what impacts do you cause for the students, and how do you think we as students we can be impacted on this? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think you've summarized very well the challenges we face, the questions that we have to answer, and we've run out of time. So, but you've got the rest of the day to cogitate on those questions and come up with some solutions. We're pointing our finger at you. You have to come up with the solutions for us. So thank you very much. If you could give the panel
Give this panel a great hand. Gary handling it very well. Heather and Joshua came up from D.C. to spend the time with us. We really appreciate that. Olivia, I don't know how far you had to come.
From Lexington, Kentucky.
Right on Street.